I think that was the worst crisis the public health system had ever faced, the COVID crisis. And the stress test didn't go well. The reaction to what seems to me like the sort of the correct response to the pandemic was a vicious attack on me and my colleagues.
I interviewed Dr. Bhattacharya, director of the National Institutes of Health and acting director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, about a recent parasite outbreak, research on aborted fetal tissue, and COVID-era censorship. To start off, during the pandemic, you co-wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, which raised questions about the way that COVID-19 was managed. What was this?
So it was a declaration I wrote with Sunetra Gupta of Oxford University and Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University, two very, very prominent and well-known epidemiologists. We were looking at the pandemic response in October 2020, and it was very clear that the lockdowns that had been adopted early in the pandemic had caused tremendous harm, especially to kids, but the school closures. There were reports about 100 million people or more facing dire food insecurity, basically starvation because of the economic dislocations caused by the lockdowns. A lot of working class people suffered, and yet there was also evidence that they hadn't worked, that the disease had spread anyways. And so we were arguing for a policy of focused protection. Protect older people better, because they were the ones who were most vulnerable to dying from COVID, and allow kids to go back to school, have sort of a much more measured response to the pandemic.
What did you learn about the public health system from that experience?
Well, I mean, now I'm the head of the acting director of the CDC, so I've learned quite a bit more. I've been studying the public health system most of my entire career, and it's a central part of helping keeping people healthy. I think that was the worst crisis the public health system had ever faced, the COVID crisis, and the stress test didn't go well. The reaction to what seems to me like the sort of the correct response to the pandemic was a vicious attack on me and my colleagues. I knew a lot of friends, including Martin Kulldorff, who was one of the authors of the declaration. He's an incredible statistician, one of the world's best statisticians. At Harvard, was fired during the pandemic because of his stance on COVID vaccines, it was disheartening because the normal process of allowing scientists to talk to each other and learn from each other, often we're wrong. That's the nature of science. And that's fine. You go to the next thing, right? That was not allowed really during the pandemic. A lot of sort of vilification and attacks on free speech rights and I think as a result, a lot of the policies that ended up happening were much worse than they otherwise would have been.
Well, you had some experiences with censorship during that time. Could you tell me a little bit about what that was?
Yeah, so I joined Twitter in 2021, August of 2021. I had spent my entire time as a professor at Stanford telling my students not to join Twitter. The best way to make a big difference in the world is write scientific papers. And then I joined Twitter in 2021. Almost immediately it was clear that I was getting lots of engagement with people who agreed with me, but I was saying very controversial things like, we shouldn't mask toddlers and stuff. So that led to, but I was puzzled why I wasn't getting any pushback, or as much pushback as I expected. It turned out, after Elon bought Twitter, that I'd been put on a blacklist. He invited me to go up to Twitter headquarters. He showed me the database, my face was there, and it said blacklist. And apparently, I learned later that the Biden administration had put together essentially a whole campaign to threaten social media companies to censor ideas that they didn't like. And a lot of people got trapped by this, but I was lucky enough to find out that it actually happened. I was part of this lawsuit, this Missouri versus Biden lawsuit, where we got to depose people in the government that had participated in this sort of censorship. What happens is that the government would go find out, they'd go fund people to identify a list of misinformation supposedly, such as the idea that the vaccine, if you posted the COVID vaccines didn't stop you from getting and spreading COVID. That was deemed misinformation, even though it was true. There were a whole kinds of other things that they deemed ideas that were too controversial to talk about. And then they would go to social media companies and say, you better censor these ideas or else we're going to go through, essentially threaten you. And a circuit court judge and a district court judge agreed with all that. We got to do lots of discovery. Unfortunately, when we got to the Supreme Court decided that me and my colleagues, we didn't have a right to sue. They said it was lack of standing. They said that because the government censored ideas and not people, apparently the government had the right to censor ideas, that unless they specifically targeted a person, they had a right to sue, they had a right to do that. The good news is that under the Trump administration, first, we stopped doing that. There's no more censoring. And then the other thing is that the Department of Justice just recently, in the last couple of months, negotiated a settlement with the remaining plaintiffs in the case with a consent decree so that this will never happen again for hopefully a considerable period of time.
Wow, that's a big accomplishment. Something kind of off of that is you've accomplished that, but how else would you say that your experience with the system being kind of weaponized against people with certain ideas has influenced the way that you lead the NIH and the CDC?
Well, I'm a big believer in free speech. I believe very fundamentally that science can't function without free speech. And I've done my level best to create an environment, both at CDC and the NIH, where controversial ideas can be discussed without any vilification or attacks on people just because they think something that's different than what everyone else thinks. I've tried to, like for instance, at the NIH, one of the things I did is I have a policy of academic freedom. You'd think a place like the NIH, which is deeply academic in nature, because we fund research any research is going to be academic in nature. You need academic freedom, but it didn't have a policy like this. The policy says that, like say you're a scientist here, you make a discovery, and I, the director of the NIH, don't like your discovery. You still get to publish it. Like you don't have to ask my permission to publish it. You get to publish it. That policy, I think, protects all the institution pretty fundamentally, because it says that I, as a political appointee, can't interfere with your science.
Absolutely. And the World Health Organization also opposed your approach to COVID-19. The Trump administration has left who, as someone who's had that experience with it, what would your defense be of that decision?
For the WHO, I think the WHO was, it embraced lockdowns. It didn't speak up for open scientific discussion. It made many mistakes during the pandemic. The worst was, I think that their job is to protect global public health, and the kinds of advice they were giving to many places ignored the broader notion of public health that they're supposed to protect. And certainly, I think that they didn't protect American interests. The United States funds the WHO at a very high level, or funded until President Trump pulled us back from it. I think that an organization like the WHO, I love its mission. Its mission is to improve the health of every person in the world. Right? That's its mission. It's a great mission. I think that the reality of the WHO during the pandemic is that it failed at that mission in ways that sort of showed sort of gaps that I think are difficult to impossible to address. And I think that the U.S. pulling out and then establishing this America First global strategy, global health strategy, that has a better possibility of establishing global public health missions that actually do improve the health of the world while protecting American interests.
Absolutely. And something that you've done at NIH several months ago was you cut funding for the use of fetal tissue for research. How big of an issue was this before?
Well, so we did that. So we ended the use of aborted fetal tissue in research. Mm-hmm. Now, in order to make a justification for that, like I personally am pro-life, but that's not enough of a justification, right? What needs to happen is we have to have you have to establish neutral principles for why you're making decisions. And I have two that I've established, I apply to this. First, the NIH mission is to support research that improves the health and longevity of people. Great, beautiful mission, right? If we're to achieve that mission, the means that we use to do that research must be ethically acceptable to as broad a set of the population as possible, right? So imagine I do some amazing study, but I violate violate ethical norms so that most of the population, most people believe that I've done something terrible. The fruits of that terrible thing would be broadly unacceptable to most of the population. So no matter how brilliant the idea that comes out of that would be, it's not achieving the mission of the NIH, which is to improve health, extend life, right? So it's so regardless of where anyone stands on abortion or these issues, which are obviously issues where people disagree pretty fundamentally, the NIH needs to focus its resources, our resources, on ideas and projects that are broadly ethically acceptable. And it's just a fact that the use of aborted human tissue in research was, for a pretty substantial part of the population, not ethically acceptable. So there's that. The second thing is, if you look at the data, so we have to be driven by science, right, at the NIH, and even the policy decisions we make. And so like when you look at the data, the use of aborted fetal tissue in research had declined pretty substantially. And that's not surprising, that there were technological advances, the use of adult stem cells, other technologies that substituted for aborted human fetal tissue in research, so that researchers are increasingly have adopted those new technologies rather than going to use aborted human fetal tissue. So to me, that was a relatively easy decision. You have two sort of neutral principles that push in the same direction, and I think it makes the NIH portfolio much more sort of ethically acceptable to the population at large.
Have you heard from scientists who had ethical concerns about this, who are relieved that this is no longer something that's being done?
I mean, it's, as you can imagine, given the nature of the abortion debate in this country, there's people who like it and people who don't like it. As I've said, I personally am pro-life. So you can probably imagine which side I'm more sympathetic to. But to me, that's less important than the neutral principles we use to justify this, right? Because now it's if there's a new NIH director, several years from now, and they want to reverse it, they'll have to run up against neutral principles. They'll have to say, yeah, it's okay to do research that results in products and ideas that are ethically unacceptable to half the population. That's fine. That's a good idea. They're not going to be able to do that with a straight face.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Is there anything else related to this that needs to be done in the future?
Well, one thing that we're doing is we're looking at the embryonic stem cells. Human embryonic stem cells, that's a different and distinct issue than aborted human fetal tissue. I think it's less ethically conflicted for the population. I think like surveys that suggest about 30% of the population think it's ethically unacceptable. The stem cells, there are set number of stem cell lines. I think there's I forget exactly, 500-ish stem cell lines. The policy we have is that we're not going to establish any new stem cell lines, but the existing lines that are already used in research. So stem cells are, cells that you can replicate, and so you're not like going back to, kids or whatever to get them. They grow in petri dishes or whatever. So you can keep reusing them over and over and over again. So there's 500 lines to use that research sometimes use, and they're used in lots of different important scientific investigations on eye disease, heart disease, lung disease, brain, sort of a whole range of neurological conditions. They're used for fundamental research. The lines themselves are often established as donations from, like maybe someone has a miscarriage, and the family decides to donate the stem cells from the baby to science. So it's more complicated an issue than the human fetal tissue. And so what I've done is I've asked for comments from the scientific community and from the public about this issue. To tell us, what will be missing scientifically if we remove a certain stem cell line. How ethically conflicted would you feel? Would you be willing to accept a product that's made out of this? I think, again, I remember the two principles. The second one is I want data to inform decisions. I want it to be ethically acceptable. The products of NIH research to be ethically acceptable as large a group as possible. So what we're doing now is a policy process to try to understand how the public falls, the scientific public and the American public falls on this issue.
Wow, interesting. And you're also, in addition to leading the NIH, you're the acting director of the CDC. A lot of people are concerned right now about a parasite on their produce. What would you say to them should they feel confident that the CDC is looking into this and has it under control?
That's a good question, because that's actually, I literally just came out of a briefing for that from the CDC. That's cyclospora. It's a parasite, but it's an easily treated parasite. Actually, it's a relatively inexpensive antibiotic, can actually treat it. It happens every summer that there's an outbreak. So we don't usually hear about it. The reason we're hearing about it because there was a big outbreak this summer as a result of lettuce specifically from a few suppliers to Taco Bell. And it's in a few states where the big outbreak has happened: Michigan, Ohio, are the two big states where this has been a big deal. It's one of those things where, like, the CDC has been tracking this, working closely with the FDA to identify the source. Turns out it's farms in Mexico with imported lettuce. Anyways, there's been a lot of weird misreporting saying that there have been cuts to our tracking of it. And I can just tell you this is categorically untrue. I talked with the CDC staff who are in charge of tracking this, again, working with the FDA, informing American people about how to keep themselves safe from having to deal with this, and working with suppliers who don't want to sell produce that make people sick. And so you have an ecosystem that actually has worked well in this case. Of course, you can't avoid that sometimes disease happens. But what you can do is that when it happens, identify the source relatively quickly, take good steps to inform the public about how to protect themselves, and then give treatment to people who are sick. That's what we've done here.
Interesting. And you're overseeing some other disease responses to measles, Ebola, et cetera. Could you give an update on how all of that is going?
Sure. Okay, so let's do measles. There have been big outbreaks in the last 3-4 years here in the United States, but not just in the United States. In Canada, in Mexico, in Europe. I think Canada actually lost its measles eradication status, if I got that right. The reason for these outbreaks have been because during the pandemic there was a drop in the uptake of the measles vaccine, which is the very best way to stop you from getting measles and spreading it. Because of that, and then not just in the United States, lots and lots of places, in part because I think the kind of public health response that happened during the pandemic, the lockdowns, the school closures, a lot of people lost their confidence in public health and stopped taking advice from public health on things like measles prevention. That is very unfortunate because measles is especially for little kids, it can be bad. I mean, there have been deaths from measles infections, even in the United States. And so the CDC has been working very hard, and actually it turns out in the United States, it turns out to be not a general increase in measles everywhere, but like particular communities of people, who, for whatever reason, they're more distrustful of vaccines, and so they're like particular communities of people say, I'm not going to take it. There was a big outbreak in Texas, which is now under control. There's a big outbreak in South Carolina, which is under control. Outbreaks in Michigan, all across the country. You've seen sort of outbreaks. Right now, there's an outbreak in Virginia, and we're working on addressing it. The total numbers are on their way down, but I'd like to see it, close to zero. So we're working very hard to make that happen. So measles, that's measles. Ebola, on the other hand, is nowhere near under control. In the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, there was an outbreak that started most likely in February, with a variant of the Ebola virus, which kills like 30–40% of the people that it infects. This particular variant it's a rare variant, so they weren't really testing for it. Started in February, big outbreak starts, like we become aware of it in like late June-ish, and to date there have been 2,000 cases and 700 deaths in Eastern DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a region that is not really under the full control of the government. They're like rebel militias that control it, and so it's very hard to do basic public health in those regions. And there have been a few imported cases to Uganda, but it has the potential to be the biggest Ebola outbreak in history.
Wow. And there's been, of course, everyone's heard a lot about the Make America Healthy agenda of HHS, but I think it could be hard for some to picture what that looks like at NIH particularly. Could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
sure. So, I mean, we've taken MAHA very, very seriously at the NIH, right? So what does it mean, right? So it means thinking carefully about the things that make most people most unhealthy in this country. You know, chronic disease, including diabetes, heart disease, answering basic questions like what are like good diets, like how do you maintain lifestyles that actually can promote good health for you. Tackling questions that are taboo, like what's the cause of autism? What's the cause of the rise in the prevalence of autism? The NIH it's a scientific organization, so the answers sometimes take a long time to get to, but you have to ask the questions first. So what we've done is made sure that we ask those questions here at the NIH, so we can have excellent science, replicable gold standard science that can get good answers for some of the most troubling questions that Americans have regarding their health.
You responded on X, I believe today, to a report saying that NIH wasn't using its full budget and wasn't working at its full capacity. Where do you think this came from, and can you set the record straight?
Yeah, so first of all, it's just not true. Like, so the NIH budget is about about $50 billion, $40 billion of which goes out to the universities and labs and independent labs of the country. Last year, there were all these like allegations that we weren't spending the money fast enough, that there were cuts to the NIH budget. All that just was false. It was like, I can tell you, I looked at the budget sheets myself. We made sure that the that the money went to scientific projects that aren't ideological. No more DEI funding, no more dangerous gain of function funding, but yes, funding for research that has a chance of improving the health and longevity of Americans. We spent all the money last year. This year, there was a 2-month government shutdown. And partly because of that, it was a little harder to get all the scientific reviews you need in place. It's taken a little bit longer. But we're on track to spend the money, the whole budget for the whole rest of the year. So I think it's like a political attack, you know, which is quite frustrating. Like we put the money, how much we're spending every year, up to date on the NIH Reporter website. Anyone can go look at it themselves if they don't believe me, and see how much how we're doing relative to the rest of the relative to the past years. And we're better than we were last year, despite the 2-month government shutdown. And we're going to spend the rest of the money this year on excellent gold standard science. And it was frustrating because there was one of our career staff testified in Congress, and somebody on the Democratic side sort of spread this false information in attacking a political attack on the NIH, which is really disheartening. The NIH in principle shouldn't be you shouldn't think about it as a political agency. Like, it's science that should improve the health and longevity of people. Like, who doesn't want that?
Absolutely. Is there anything else we haven't covered that you'd like to add?
No, I think you covered a lot of ground. It was really nice to talk with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.